Thank you everyone for coming to the 2022 Laureate Awards ceremony. I'm sorry to be a little bit late. We had a bit of technical difficulty. I have the most pleasant task of chairing this event, overseeing the celebration of individuals who have led extraordinary professional lives and whose careers have really shaped our field. So I'm delighted to have the honor on behalf of IUSSP of giving this award to Professor Peter McDonald. But before that, let me take a moment to say a little on the IUSSP Laureate Award. It was begun in 1991, as you see, to honor the lifetime achievement of exceptional leaders who have expanded our field and for their contributions to the advancement of population sciences, their services to the world community of population scientists, and including to the Union. The individual must be nominated by members of at least 5 different nationalities and is selected by the council through a secret ballot. The award is given annually, and since it was started in 1991, we've never missed a year. So we are so proud that Peter is our 32nd laureate. Peter needs no introduction in our field. I know that many of us, like me, are awed by his achievements. Before I turn the floor to some of Peter's closest colleagues and friends, let me cite the wide array of issues to which Peter has contributed and that have made him so very deserving of this award. Peter's academic contributions have been wide-ranging and won him great acclaim. He's done thought-provoking research on issues of such great relevance to our field and really enhanced the field across the globe. His work on gender equity theory applied to fertility is path-breaking and has been profoundly influential. He's also contributed to what we know about transitions to adulthood in Indonesia, about fertility transition in Iran, about aging and the needs of the elderly, about family, nuptiality, culture, and much more. He has a passion for investing in the next generation, having trained hundreds of young demographers, a few of whom we will hear from today. His work hasn't stopped with publications. He has skillfully ensured that his research is translated into programs and policies, made input into Australia's policies in multiple and diverse areas, ranging from migration to work, family, social inclusion, fertility, and aging. And Peter has contributed hugely to IUSSP. He has served the Union in one capacity or the other since the 1980s. He served on the IUSSP Council since 2001, culminating with President in 2010 to 2013, and Emeritus President thereafter. It's been a long love affair with the Union, and he remains tied to it, most recently playing a leading role in bringing the 2025 IPC conference to Brisbane. I don't want to take any time from those who know Peter far better than I do. So let me stop here and turn the floor to Peter's closest colleagues and friends. As you see, here's the program. And let me turn the floor to Gavin Jones from Australia National University, who will speak about his early career. Go ahead, Gavin.
Thank you, Shireen, and greetings, everybody. I've been a friend and colleague of Peter for a very long time, so it's probably appropriate that I be the one to say a few words here about Peter's early career. Peter grew up in Sydney and graduated Bachelor of Commerce with honours from the University of New South Wales in 1966 having majored in economic statistics. His honours thesis was entitled Stochastic Linear Programming and was graded as high distinction level. He was then appointed a research officer, then senior research officer at the Australian Bureau of Statistics in Canberra, where he also commenced a PhD degree in demography at the Australian National University. He completed the PhD in 1972 with a thesis entitled Age at First Marriage and Proportions Marrying in Australia, 1860 to 1971. This was later published under the title Marriage in Australia. In 1971, Peter was seconded for 4 months as lecturer in demography to the Faculty of Economics, University of Indonesia, with support from the Australian Asian Universities Cooperation Scheme. It was in 1972 that Peter's and my paths first crossed in Indonesia. I had been working for the Population Council in New York, then in Thailand, and was seconded to work with the Demographic Institute at the University of Indonesia. Peter also returned to the Demographic Institute, where we were both involved in a visionary project led by the head of the Institute, Dr. Iskandar, to develop a cadre of demographers in all the state universities in Indonesia by training one or more faculty member from each university in demography, relying on them to introduce the study in their own universities. Peter and I were both involved in this intensive training program conducted in Jakarta, but each of us also had to travel widely throughout Indonesia because Dr. Iskandar's vision included the mounting of a fertility mortality survey in which the newly trained demographers would utilize their students as interviewers to enable a remarkably comprehensive survey to be mounted across most of the major regions of Indonesia. Our time working together in the University of Indonesia was certainly challenging, including learning a new language, but it was also a time of great enjoyment. One thing we both enjoyed in our limited spare time was climbing volcanoes, which are liberally sprinkled across Java. The slide there, you can see Peter horsing around with me and Indonesian colleagues on one such climb. The second, we can show the following, yes, the second 2 slides show Peter and friends at the summit of Gunung Slamet, the second tallest volcano in Java, at a height of 3,430 meters. So you can see that Peter was not only an astute demographer, but also physically very fit. Peter continued to work at the Demographic Institute under Ford Foundation auspices until 1976, when he returned to Australia to join the Department of Demography at the Australian National University as research fellow. His involvement with Indonesia continued throughout his career. An early example was his organization of the Indonesian Marriage Survey in 1978, which enabled the diverse pattern of marriage across different regions of Indonesia to be studied. To round out this brief survey of Peter's early career, I should note that in 1982, he spent 6 months as consultant to the World Fertility Survey in London. Then in 1983, he took up the position of Deputy Director Research at the Australian Institute of Family Studies in Melbourne, where he supervised an innovative research program over the following decade. A number of important studies on the Australian family were published over that period. In 1995, Peter moved back to the Australian National University as professor, and in 1996, took over headship of the demography program. But that is getting well beyond what we can consider his early career. I should highlight that throughout his career, Peter made a major contribution in teaching, and his experience in Indonesia carried through to his subsequent contributions to teaching and graduate student supervision in Australia and beyond, which will be elaborated in more detail by later speakers. How should I sum up Peter's early career as it reflects him as a person? I think he showed the same characteristics that many of you have witnessed in his more recent career, including as president of IUSSP. He was hardworking, a highly competent demographer, a perceptive theorist, and innovative in planning research projects. but equally as important, he was a good colleague and fair-minded in dealing with people at all levels. And he was fun to be around. What more could one ask? Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. Our next speakers will be John Casterline, and then from Ohio State, and Mary Brinton from Harvard, speaking about Peter's major theoretical contributions. So, John, are you going first?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Shireen. And let me say I'm delighted to have been invited to contribute to this event, honoring a scholar for whom I have nothing but the highest admiration. I'll also note I've had the personal pleasure of interacting with Peter professionally in multiple instances and multiple capacities over the decades. I'm guessing that with the exception of Gavin, my association with Peter has been lengthier than anyone else on the program for this session. I first met Peter at the East-West Center in Hawaii in June 1976, if you can believe it. And we have crossed paths various times since then, including service together on the IUSSP Council in the early 2000s. And in fact, we co-authored a journal article, again, some decades ago on spousal age difference, still occasionally gets cited. When I first met Peter, he had recently been conducting research on marriage in Indonesia. Indonesia is where Peter first undertook research in demography, post-PhD, post his dissertation research on Australia. And while I suppose he's better known for his contributions to our understanding of low fertility, and Mary will be commenting on this, Peter has never suspended for long his program of research on low-income and middle-income countries. My own research has been on fertility declines in these countries. And in the brief time today that I've been allotted, I want to highlight contributions Peter has made to our understanding of these fertility declines. Most notably, this has been his analysis of the fertility decline in Iran, in collaboration with his superb team of Iranian collaborators, several of whom are also contributing to this session. I'm guessing they won't feel it's appropriate to evaluate the work they've conducted together, so I will do that. This research has been published in a series of journal articles and in a co-authored book published in, I think it's 2009. Thanks to Peter and his Iranian collaborators, the Iranian decline, which was remarkable in its pace, as probably most of you know, is among the most completely described and among the most thoughtfully explained of any contemporary decline. Indeed, asked to identify the best country case studies that we possess, I would rank Iran near the top, certainly among the half dozen or so fertility declines that have been most effectively analyzed. There are two features of the Iranian case study that deserve spotlighting, and they are revealing of Peter as a scholar. First is the thoroughness of the description of this decline that Peter and his collaborators have produced. The demographic analysis in their work is without peer, I think. They examine parity-specific fertility dynamics, tempo effects, the role of nuptiality change, the nature of the contraceptive impact, and so forth. I cannot point to another country case study where we have such a complete and detailed portrait of the nature of the reproductive change that occurred. Really, I think it's the best we have, the best in the literature. This is complemented by a wonderfully balanced assessment of the forces that drove this incredibly dramatic fertility decline. In the author's 2009 book, this assessment is contained in the first and the final chapters. In the first chapter, the authors nicely assemble and summarize the contending explanations for the fertility decline. It's a great concise overview, kind of a primer in fertility theory. I recommend it to you as a candidate for a syllabus for a graduate seminar. Then in the final chapter, Peter and his co-authors march through the contending explanations, concisely offering their judgments about what was of greater and lesser importance. As it happens, they feature an explanation that I feel is underrepresented in this very large literature on contemporary fertility declines, namely a mismatch between households' material aspirations and their material realities. It's a problem of aspirations running ahead of what is possible. This becomes a motivation for having fewer children. It's a form of a relative income argument, really, that, as I said, I don't encounter much in the literature on contemporary declines, but which I think merits far more recognition and respect. And I think it's to the credit of this team that they recognized this explanation and featured it. There's a larger point here about Peter as a scholar. There's no question Peter's an empiricist in his bones to the maximum. And yet he combines this with a theoretical touch, a theoretical sensitivity that I think is rare among those who perform the kind of sophisticated and detailed demographic analysis that Peter carries out. It's an exceptional combination. And by any measure, Peter is an exceptional scholar. I was pleased to second the nomination that Gavin crafted and to join in that nomination, and even more pleased that the nomination was successful. Peter is fully deserving of the IUSSP Laureate Award. It's a great pleasure to participate in this moment. Okay, Shireen.
Well, I think the floor has moved to me. I'm Mary Brinton from Harvard University. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers so much for inviting me to participate in this panel in honor of Peter McDonald. I really appreciate the opportunity. It may seem like a rather outrageous statement, but I can say that Peter McDonald changed my life. This sounds particularly outrageous given that I have only ever met Peter once at a PAA meeting a number of years ago when we participated on the same panel. But his theoretical work on gender equity and low fertility began to change the course of my own career, research career over 10 years ago, and also changed that of a number of my graduate students. His work provided the crucial insight that helped me to combine my training and interests in social demography, in the sociological study of gender stratification and inequality, and in social change in East Asia, particularly Japan. His work also facilitated my engagement and collaboration with European demographers who are expanding their interest in theories of low fertility in Europe to the phenomenon of low fertility in East Asia, which was my concern. In the brief time I have today, I'd like to speak first to the contribution of Peter's work to the study of the second demographic transition, and then to some of the future challenges I see in bringing to full fruition the theoretical and empirical potential of the work. In his seminal article, Gender Equity in Theories of Fertility Transition, published in Population and Development Review in 2000, Peter addressed the apparent conundrum that a higher level of gender equity was necessary to achieve lower fertility in so-called developing countries, while at the same time, a higher level of gender equity was necessary to forestall very low fertility in so-called advanced countries. He tackled this paradox by articulating the crucial difference between gender equity in family-oriented institutions and in what he called individual-oriented institutions, education, the labor market, and politics, the public sphere. Peter expanded upon the ideas presented in the gender equity article in many subsequent pieces, but the 2000 PDR article alone has generated more than 1,500 citations over the years. I think it is not an understatement to say that he changed the course of research on low fertility, a subject that had been previously understood principally through the lens of second demographic transition theory. I've always felt that the most concise statement of gender equity theory is at the powerful conclusion of that 2000 PDR article. Very low fertility rates will persist unless gender equity within family-oriented institutions rises to much higher levels than prevail today. Not surprisingly, much of the attention given to the theoretical framework linking gender equity and fertility has come from European demographers puzzling through the historically low fertility rates experienced in many parts of Europe over the past decades. Most attention has focused on how to empirically test hypotheses generated from the framework. And in order to do so, many social demographers tried to operationalize gender equity in the household while simultaneously paying attention to what they considered gender equity or inequity in the public sphere. This has resulted in a large body of empirical research, I should say a huge body of empirical research that brought to the fore the role of intra-household gender dynamics in affecting the number of births experienced by partnered women, and in particular, the role of such dynamics in influencing fertility intentions and the transition to second birth, crucially important for studies of low and lowest low fertility. The body of empirical research generated by Peter's theory can be characterized, to my mind, by three things. First, most, though not all, empirical articles have focused on couple-level fertility within given societies, rather than on cross-national comparisons, which was, after all, the focus of Peter's original theory. Second, empirical research has used a range of indicators, with the chief measure of gender equity in families being the gender division of household labor. Admittedly, this is the most common measure of inter-household gender inequality available in large-scale social surveys. But this is related to a third issue, empirical issue, whether indicators of gender equality within the household are the same as gender equity. And I'll come back to this point at the end of my comments. The plethora of empirical articles following the publication of the theory of gender equity was not matched by theoretical elaborations on the framework by demographers until the publication of two articles, also in PDR, in 2015. Goldscheider et al.'s The Gender Revolution, a framework for understanding changing family and demographic behavior, and Esping, Anderson, and Billery's Retheorizing Family Demographics. To me, these two articles extended the theory by recasting it back to Peter's original focus on cross-national fertility transitions over time. So, what work remains to be done? I feel that the generative effect of the gender equity framework will continue to be realized if we set ourselves to the task of tackling a number of further challenges. These include recognizing that we must delineate what gender equity means and when and how it differs from gender inequality. We must also take into account how variation in so-called individual-oriented institutions in different societies, especially the structure of labor market institutions, affects the reproduction of gender inequality in the public sphere. So I'm calling for more attention to the delineation of public sphere institutions and how they affect gender inequality and hence fertility. And also, I think we need to consider how gender equity at the couple level affects fertility when the couple is in a highly gender unequal society, such as Japan. But overall, we owe these and other challenges to the vision Peter has given us of how low fertility emerged as a central issue facing post-industrial societies. And for that, I am most grateful.
Thank you, Mary. Now I'll turn the floor to Professor Mohammad Jalal Abbasi Shahbazi from the University of Tehran, who will speak on new understanding of demographic trends. Jalal, over to you.
Yes, Shireen, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. It's a great honor for me to.
Sorry, hold on, Paul.
Yes, there you go.
Can I start?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a great honor for me to join this the group and many friends and honoring Peter's contribution to demography and for the achievements he has made so far. And I'll be highlighting only a few areas that Peter has contributed to our discipline: his leadership in demography, his passion for scholarship, his support for establishing and fostering regional population associations, and also I will touch upon some of his personal qualities. My first meeting with Peter started in 1995, exactly 27 years ago, when I joined the ANU demography program as a PhD student. And interestingly, Peter also joined that meeting as a new staff member. We discussed about my PhD thesis and topic. He gave me one paragraph the day after, and I returned him a PhD thesis with a couple of published articles that I come to it later, 3 years later. Then I did a postdoc under his supervision, and our collaboration started in 2001, and it has continued since, which we have enjoyed, and we have been able to produce some of the best quality papers that John Casterline mentioned, not me. It was interesting that John also touched upon those issues. And also we collaborated on the APA establishment and also through the IUSSP. During Peter's leadership at the ANU, many PhD students were graduated, many projects were conducted. It was really, I mean, a time that there were fundraising for different projects. And also he led the demography program to become as one of the main and best and known institutions internationally. I worked with Peter on different areas. One was on Australian multiculturalism and immigrant fertility, and second one on Iran's fertility transition that led to several projects, including the one on abortion in Iran that Meimanat Hosseini did. And also, as a side sort of impact of the training that I had and work that I did with Peter, we also worked on the demography of refugee and forced migration. As we know, Australia is one of the sort of multicultural society with diverse migrant groups. That our results showed that migrants have diverse patterns and levels of fertility. They generally have lower fertility than the native born. Their contribution to population growth, though, is very minimal. And interestingly, under the multiculturalism in Australia, some migrants groups have been able to maintain their culture while adapting to the Australian society, and these have been published in different articles. One of the main findings of our research, which actually was found in early 1998 during my postdoc, was the phenomenal fall of fertility in Iran. This remarkable fall happened in an Islamic country, needed an explanation. And I was fortunate enough that I had Peter as a supervisor and colleague to start the research and collaboration for the explanation of this phenomenal fall of fertility. Through different Wellcome Trust projects, we were able to use DHS censuses plus 2 large surveys that we conducted. We applied methodological sort of approach using the own children method and parity progression ratio method that Meimanat did in her thesis, applying to Iranian data for the first time, and also applying social and demographic theories. We tried to explain and understand Iranian fertility decline. And again, another Peter's characteristics was to give these results to policymakers. We were able to engage with policymakers on revising the population policy in Iran. And of course, over the years, it led to many publications and many presentations at the University of Tehran at the University of Shiraz, University of Isfahan, Population Association of Iran. And that created a link that led us sort of to presentations internationally, to many conferences, and also finally, after 10 years, we were able to publish this book that John elaborated on the findings of the book. The book was received a prize for the best book of the year in Iran, and it was launched at the IUSSP conference in 2009 in Marrakesh. That was one of the examples. The second example was Peter's contribution to Indonesian demography. He worked with late Ariana Utomo, Terry Hall, Gavin Jones, and Ariana Utomo, and others in conducting two major surveys: transition to adulthood in Greater Jakarta and the needs of elder persons living in villages across Indonesia, that led again to many publications and policy papers. Beside these contributions, Peter was generous in fostering Asian demography. Terry, Gavin, and a few other Asian demographers were involved in the establishment of Asian Population Association, and Peter supported us not only through the ANU, but through the IUSSP. This is the meeting that we had at the IUSSP conference. And also he attended the Asian Population Association conference in Thailand in 2012 as the IUSSP president. Indeed, he tried to link with the, and do a collaboration with Yangon University in Myanmar in 2013 with a number of colleagues, and also as an international advisor to the Asian Demographic Research Institute that I was also a member of. And this is one of the forums that Wolfgang Lutz and the director of the institute and many other Asian demographers attended. It's not fair to only focus on Peter's scientific achievements. His personal qualities and characteristics also deserve mentioning. I'd like to express my prayer for the health of his wife, Helen Moyle, who is in this photo. Peter also has been friend and generous to all his PhD students. He's open to school children, he's friend of school children. And this is one of this, a photo from one of our sightseeing in when we're conducting the survey in Mashhad. And also he likes sightseeing. This is a visit that he paid to Kish Island in 2007. Finally, let me read through these statements. When I was involved in the nomination of Peter for Irene Tauber Award, a number of colleagues joined and expressed their views. Let me read these statements. Late Caldwell mentioned that he is quite outstanding in his enthusiasm for developing new analytical approaches in areas where innovation appeared to be slowing down. Phil Morgan from the US, he wrote that he is a mentor to many students and an outstanding colleague. He shares his ideas and his criticism freely. Late Graham Higo wrote, McDonald's research is always a judicious combination of sophisticated application of advanced technical procedures, a social understanding and appreciation of appropriate theory, and a recognition of social justice and equity, as well as drawing out the implications for policy. John Casterline, our friend who is in this meeting also, he wrote that his contribution were always appropriate, respectful of others' interests, and often imaginative, and he was entirely conscientious and reliable. McDonald is among the small set of outstanding scholars who also possesses exceptional institutional skills. And finally, Francesco Billari wrote that if the committee decides to pick Professor McDonald, this will be a highly deserved choice, which will add a great name to this Hall of Fame. Unfortunately, Peter received the Irene Tauber Award on 30th of April 2015, and congratulations to Peter for the well-deserved IUSSP Laureate Award on 30th of June 2020. Thank you. 2022. Thank you.
Thanks, Dalal. Now let me turn over to Rebecca Kippen from Monash University, who will talk about his contributions to demographic training. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Thank you. I'm delighted and honoured to speak about Peter's contributions to demographic training. In 1996, Professor Peter McDonald was appointed head of the demography program at the Australian National University, where he had completed his PhD 24 years earlier. At the time of his return, Demography ANU had an international reputation for outstanding demographic training of students from around the world. The vast majority of students being trained returned to their countries of origin to work in universities, develop and administer censuses and vital registration systems, and analyse the resultant data. However, in considering the demography of Australian demographers, Peter noted that there was a dearth of up-and-coming young demographers within Australia. On Peter's return to ANU, graduate studies in demography became fully integrated with the ANU demography program. Course offerings were redesigned and expanded, and an advertising campaign was launched to attract Australian students to these courses at master's and PhD level, in addition to international students. Also in 1996, in a rural university far, far away from ANU, I finished my undergraduate degree in accounting and mathematics with a smattering of social science. I didn't want to be an accountant and wasn't sure what to do with my degree. As part of its advertising campaign, ANU had sent out a call for summer research scholarships in demography, and I was fortunate enough to get one, not realising it was a front for PhD recruitment. So in December 96, I arrived in Canberra for a 6-week ANU demography research scholarship and was privileged to stay for the next 13 years through postgraduate studies in demography and then as a research fellow. So Mary, Peter McDonald changed my life too. Peter was and still is extraordinarily generous with his time and expertise to all students, colleagues and others, with a literal open door policy, what seems to be never-ending patience and a wacky sense of humour. Peter supervised the summer scholarship, taught population coursework subjects at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. He's an outstanding teacher as well as researcher, and supervised research masters, PhD students and postdoctoral fellows. ANU Demography retained and strengthened its international reputation for demographic training under Peter's leadership. He also generously mentored students as research assistants on a fair wage, including them as named investigators on funded projects and giving them first authorship on co-authored papers to bolster their future careers. This was an amazing experience and springboard for myself and dozens of others, and I think we aspire to do the same with our own students. One of Peter's many gifts in teaching and mentorship is to demonstrate how our research can have real-world, national and international impact through evidence-based policy, and the beauty of numbers in providing insight to human behaviour and demographic change and informing demographic theory. Peter, on behalf of the hundreds of students you have taught, supervised, mentored and inspired over the past few decades, thank you for your dedication and passion in training the next generation of demographers who are now working around the world, and congratulations on this most well-deserved award. And in conclusion, I still take to heart your wise words that demography is the study of fertility, mortality, migration, and anything else I'm interested in. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Now I turn the floor to Jeromey Temple from University of Melbourne, who's speaking on Peter's service to governments and to policy formulation. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's indeed a great pleasure to comment on the policy impact of Professor Peter McDonald. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the peoples of the Kulin Nation on whose land I live and work, and I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. McDonald's early impacts on policy in Australia date back to his time at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. His work there involved detailed analyses of the economic consequences of marriage breakdown, contributing to the use of superannuation holdings as assets when they'd often been ignored by the court, and provided key data for Australia's first child support scheme. During this time, he also worked on the introduction of the family allowance supplement that assisted vulnerable families and the introduction of the Keating Labor government's low-income dental scheme. As a member of the Victorian Children and Family Services Council, he conducted a review of the juvenile justice system in Victoria, which led to the redevelopment of the juvenile prison for Anna. Following his tenure at the Institute of Family Studies, McDonald was principal consultant on the Labor government's Urban and Regional Development Review. When I queried the use of McDonald's work with the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, Brian Howe, he noted its importance to the Hawke government, both in our review of social security policy and in the National Housing Strategy Review. Howe further stated that McDonald made an important contribution to public policy over many years, and that Peter's contribution to demography in Australia is first class and fully deserves international recognition. On return to ANU, McDonald focused his policy-related research on Australian demographic issues. In particular, he returned to family policy. In the lead up to the 2004 election, he was active with the federal government's review and with both political parties to provide additional support for families with children. Considerable improvements were made to income support for families with children and to childcare support as part of this process. Indeed, across his long career, McDonald has been a strong advocate of support for families with children. Earlier in 1999, he worked with Rebecca Kippen, who we just heard from, for the Department of Immigration, which led to the minister at the time, Philip Ruddock, taking a paper to Cabinet to argue for higher levels of immigration to Australia to lessen the impacts of population ageing. This approach was adopted, and impacts on population ageing had remained a rationale for Australian immigration policy until today. This impact was stronger when, with Jeromey Temple, he produced a series of 3 policy papers for the Department of Immigration that specified a range of the level of immigration that optimised the impact of immigration on GDP per capita. The recommendation was adopted by the then Gillard government, with the level of the nation's immigration program being set from 2011 in the middle of the range that had been specified in the research. The level was then maintained by subsequent governments through to 2019-20, when the intake was lowered to the lower end of the range. The work has underpinned Australian immigration policy for a decade and is supported by both sides of government. When I spoke with the former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration and Citizenship on McDonald's contribution, Abul Rizvi stated, his influence on immigration policy has been immense. Professor McDonald's demographic analysis was fundamental to the Howard government's decision to significantly increase the level of skilled migration from the early 2000s. The change in settings has continued to this day. In more recent years, the Commonwealth government has continued to rely on Professor McDonald's advice on immigration policy. There's no academic I know of who has had more influenced Australia's long-term population and economic directions. McDonald's work in Australian policy has also helped those in the not-for-profit sector sharpen their research and policy focus. One example is the advice and reports he has provided to the Scanlon Foundation on issues about immigration and population change more generally. When I questioned influential Australian businessman and chair of the Scanlon Foundation, Peter Scanlon, on McDonald's influence, he noted, Peter has had a major impact on work at the Scanlon Foundation since its inception over 20 years ago. He's expertly analysed and interpreted the data and continually guided our path of understanding and assisting the successful settlement of migrants into Australia. Peter not only brings the facts, but he expertly conveys their meaning and, most importantly, their consequences for both the now and for the future. Given the breadth and depth of McDonald's contribution to Australian policy making, it's not surprising that successive Prime Ministers have publicly noted his impact. Australia's 30th Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, invited McDonald to present on population policy to all Australian premiers and chief ministers at the Council of Australian Governments meeting, and later referred to him as the great Professor McDonald. Following the COAG meeting, a Treasurers Forum on Population was created, a Minister for Population was appointed, and a new Centre for Population was created in the Commonwealth Department of Treasury, with McDonald consulted on the form and the research agenda for the new Centre for Population. Prior to Morrison's tenure, the 29th Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, referred to him as arguably the world's leading demographer. So apologies to the many accomplished demographers attending the ceremony today. Although my time is nearly up, I'd be remiss not to at least mention McDonald's considerable impact on policy internationally, which has been informed to a large extent by his gender equity theory of fertility, which has had influence in many countries around the world. Moreover, his contribution to Indonesian policy and government initiatives has been considerable over many decades. When I asked senior Indonesian bureaucrat Pangkas Ali, director from the National Development Planning Agency, Bappenas, about McDonald's contribution, he noted, since the 1970s, Professor McDonald has contributed not only to research and education, but also to policy formulation stretching from population, education, health, and social aspects of Indonesia's development. Professor McDonald supported the development of the earliest population projection, which was set as a foundation for Indonesian national development planning in the 1980s. Through teaching and research, Professor McDonald continues to share his expertise with government to inform policy formulation in Indonesia. His recommendation on the importance of increasing female participation in the labour force also shaped women's empowerment in the country. Professor McDonald has supervised many PhD students who now have taken on various important positions in Indonesia. So in closing, Peter's contribution to successive governments and policy in Australia extends numerous decades across numerous governments of differing persuasion, across various government departments and agencies, and also within the not-for-profit sector. As numerous influential Australians have attested, this impact has been immense, unique in its breadth, and likely to be enduring for many years to come. Thank you very much to the IUSSP for this invitation.
Thank you, Jeremy. Now we move to some additional words from his former students, Ariana Utomo from the University of Melbourne and Meimanat Hosseini-Chavoshi from University of Melbourne too. Okay, so Ariana, you'll start.
Thank you very much. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land where I and also Peter now live and work. And I would like to pay my respect to the elders in past and present. I met Pak Peter, as he is fondly known by many of his Indonesian students and colleagues, when I was a school student in the early 90s. Pak Peter actually supervised both my father's and my late mother's PhD projects. I feel extremely honored and fortunate to also have had Professor Peter McDonald as my supervisor and to be able to refer to him as my longtime mentor and friend. From Pak Peter and his mates who are also here in Zoom today, Pak Gavin, Pak Terry, Bu Tuning, Pak Aris, I learned that it is one thing to have a good set of technical skills as a demographer, but most importantly, we need to have a sound understanding of the underlying nature of the socio-political and cultural context, as well as the working of institutions in the societies where the data are situated. Now, it's one thing to have the privilege to be supervised by a brilliant demographer who is an IUSSP laureate, but it is another level of extreme privilege and luck to have had a PhD supervisor who was kind, generous, and supportive throughout your career. Pak Peter's most cited work is Gender Equity Theories in Fertility Transition, and I can attest that he really does walk the talk. Pak Peter has always been supportive of the challenges that I face in navigating what we in academia label as career interruption in our job and grant application. And more generally, he's always been supportive in helping other students in trying to tackle the complex terrain of mothering in academia. Dr. Suharti Sutar, who is now the Secretary General of the Indonesian Ministry of Education and his former student, reminded us how Pak Peter helped to establish the Singarimbun Scholarship so that PhD students at ANU Demography with scholarship from the Indonesian government can send their kids to public schools in Canberra for free. Indeed, Pak Peter works with many students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. As someone that I truly look up to, I can only wish to emulate the ways in which Pak Peter work and collaborate in a respectful, egalitarian, and non-extractive manner with students and colleagues from and in different parts of the world. One of his many students from Indonesia, Dr. Ima Batubara, wrote to me, and I quote, so most of us know Pak Peter as an undisputedly well-known and respected demographer, but I bet not many know his other fun side. Ima said, Pak Peter is also such a passionate singer that once he begins to sing, he is unstoppable. In our first month or so in Canberra, he serenaded his students with The Yellow Submarine and other songs. We quickly felt welcome and at home with the department members. My colleague, Dr. Dia Hadi Setionaluri from Universitas Indonesia, wrote to me and she said, Pak Peter provided critical feedback, but he was also so very humble and kind to his students, especially to me, she said, who cried all the time during my PhD. Pak Peter was willing to sit down with his students and went through the thesis details in a serious but relaxed mode. Serius tapi santai. Ruri then went on to say, I never forget his encouragement at the end of my study, especially when he said that he's always proud of his student. So I'm really proud to be Peter's student, Ruri said. Echoing this, another of his students, Dr. Hasnani Rangkuti, wrote how Pak Peter always gave her emotional support. She remembered how she felt self-conscious whenever she had to write and present in English. But Peter was always supportive, saying, you will be fine, you are in good hands, you will be okay, and things will be okay. Hasnani sums it up beautifully for all of his students. She said, Pak Peter itu seperti ayah kita ya. Indeed, Pak Peter was like our father. Congratulations, Pak Peter. Semoga sehat selalu. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Meimanat?
You're
muted.
Whom I have known and worked with since 2002. It feels like yesterday when Dr. Abbasi proudly introduced Peter when he had come to Iran to conduct their project on fertility transition. I traveled with them to the research sites there. I was amazed by Peter's humble and genuine communication to us as junior colleagues. It was quite different from what I had experienced earlier in my workplace and at the university. My English language wasn't so good, but Peter valued on my technical contribution to their research, and I got acceptance letter from him to study demography at the ANU. So another student that her life was changed by Peter. I felt grateful for having Peter as my supervisor. I truly appreciated the way he was teaching me to a level that I could deeply understand and analyze various demographic methods and concepts. It's been an incredible ride during years that Jalal and I, with Peter's supervision and collaboration, have studied the dynamics of fertility transition in Iran. He gives his students and his junior colleagues the opportunity to grow and stand out in the academic community. He gives you a feeling of being an important researcher. Peter has many positive characteristics that deserve to be mentioned. He is not only a great population scientist, but also a devoted teacher and supervisor. He is a role model for his fine personality and wise advice. Peter is a demographer who is exceptionally excellent in technical analysis and interpretation of the research findings. He is an honest, balanced, and supportive gentleman whose support has been very valuable to his students and colleagues. His previous students, who are among the leading demographers these days, believe that he is a real friend during hardship and difficult times too. I asked Professor Anne Evans, Peter's colleague and former student, to say a few words about him. She said, large, willing to allow students to take risks, while providing unwavering support, passionate about population, and a very caring person. He never stops his generous support to students, colleagues, and friends. This is based on my own experience since I know him. Congratulations, Peter. You are the most deserved person for this prize and many more prizes. Thank you, and I wish you all the very best in your life.
Thank you, Meimanat, and thank you all for your very thoughtful remarks. Peter, I am even more overawed by your achievements. We've gone a bit over time, so instead of having comments from the floor, we would invite you to put your messages in the chat box. So please, may I request you and apologize, but the discussions have been so rich that I didn't want to put anyone off. So now we can move to the next item on the agenda. And that's the most delightful item on the agenda. We are here to recognize and celebrate the remarkable contributions that Peter has made to our field. And it gives me huge pleasure to award to you, Peter, today, on behalf of the IUSSP, the most prestigious international award made in the population sciences, the IUSSP Laureate Award 2022. I've known you since you were president of IUSSP, and of course known of you much longer. But I've learned so much more about you, and I'm so delighted to be able to give you this award. I do hope a time will come when we can congratulate you personally, either before or at IPC 2025 in Brisbane. So here is the statement, and Peter, I turn the floor to you. We're all looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Shireen, for those kind words, and I wish you well for your years of presidency of IUSSP. As Ariane has said, I'm speaking to you from Northcote in Melbourne, Australia, on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I acknowledge their elders past and present. In the field of demography, there's no more important organisation than IUSSP. So I'm greatly honoured to receive its Laureate Award. And I thank all those responsible for my nomination and the IUSSP Council for making the decision. 20 years ago, IUSSP as an organisation was somewhat shaky, but today it's exceptionally strong, playing an important leadership role in the development of the discipline across the globe, especially in the ways that IUSSP supports the regional population associations. I would like to think that I played a role in IUSSP's highly successful transition, but it would not have happened without the exceptional contribution over many years of IUSSP's Executive Director, Mary Ellen Zupan. She definitely deserves an award. Thank you, Mary Ellen. And throughout that period, Mary Ellen has been ably assisted by her deputy, Paul Monet. Thank you, Paul. Now, I attribute my award to good luck rather than good management, and I shall now proceed to thank those who enabled that good luck. My good luck story as a demographer begins when, from among some 30 new graduates, cadets, an anonymous administrator in the Australian Bureau of Statistics allocated me to the demography section. And so that's how I got involved in demography. My next piece of good luck was that I was working in Canberra, home to one of the world's leading academic groups in demography at the Australian National University. Wishing to know more about the discipline, I took myself off to ANU, where I took a one-year reading course with Mick Borry, the founder of academic demography in Australia, and the first person in the world to carry the title Professor of Demography. I came to him with a strong statistical background, but not much else. Borry was a social historian, and he instilled in me the importance of understanding the history behind the phenomenon under study. What good luck that I came across Mick in my formative years as a demographer, and I am forever indebted to him. Then the year after I commenced my PhD at ANU, in another stroke of magnificent luck, Jack Caldwell arrived from West Africa to become the new head of ANU demography and to take over my supervision. Jack held strongly that good research required the researcher to steep him or herself in the culture of the people under study. This meant getting out into the cities, towns, villages, hamlets, and households and observing for yourself. I had little of this in my early training, but Jack soon changed this by dispatching me to the Demographic Institute of the University of Indonesia, along with a lot of other Australians in the 1970s and 1980s. So it was a great scheme of kind of internship, which worked wonderfully. Indonesia is a fascinating country for anyone with an interest in culture, because its culture is so diverse. And I thank Jack for being Jack. I worked at the University of Indonesia. At the University of Indonesia, I worked with Gavin Jones, as he's described. Gavin had a large impact on my career, particularly at various points by pushing me to publish my ideas when I was a little bit reluctant. Thanks, Gavin. Among ANU Indonesianists then and now, there was a strong expectation that you would master Bahasa Indonesia. Of course, you can't learn the language of every country in which you work, but knowledge of Indonesian contributed greatly to my very long-term involvement with Indonesia. And that was part of the luck of working at ANU. And let me say in passing, referring to Mary Brinton, Mary Brinton has done great work, which I greatly admire, on East Asia, fertility in East Asia, and it stems from her knowledge of culture and language. So I acknowledge that. Thank you, Mary. In my first involvement with IUSSP, I was a member of the working group on the teaching of demography. I was still very green at the time, in very stark contrast to the other members of the group, Roland Fressard, Guillaume Wunsch, and Guillermo Maxio, all very famous demographers at that time. What great fortune to be part of such a group at a young age. Next, I spent a period at the World Fertility Survey in London. This was good luck because the WFS staff included the bright young stars of my generation. And I thank John Hobcraft and John Cleland for recruiting me to WFS. And John Casterline was also at WFS, and that's where we wrote our joint paper. Those people at WFS, those bright young stars of the generation, they're people that I've had a long connection with over future years. And I thank them for their collegiality. Now, my life took a sharp turn in 1983 when my tenure at ANU ended. I took a job as head of research in the Australian Institute of Family Studies, which was an Australian government research agency, not a university. My salary doubled overnight, but work at the Institute brought me good fortune in other ways as well. First, I supervised the work of economists, sociologists, and psychologists. To do this, I had to understand the theories that they were using in their research and work with them in an interdisciplinary way. The knowledge that I gained in those years contributed greatly to my subsequent research. During this time, I also oversaw more than 20 original field surveys, teaching me a lot about survey design. Finally, at the Institute, I met very frequently, probably too frequently, with politicians and senior public servants to discuss policy. The lessons learned from those interactions have stood me in good stead for such interaction ever since. Jeremy referred to Brian Howe, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, who I worked for a year later on. He was, I remember dealing with him often as the minister, and at one point in time waving my finger at him. Anyway, I thank all my Institute colleagues for their contribution to my knowledge. In 1995, I returned to ANU, thanks again to the support of Jack Caldwell and Gavin Jones, and this began a new phase in my career in which I was fortunate to work jointly with the students that I supervised. I worked on Australian demography with Rebecca Kippen, on Australian family studies with Edith Gray and Anne Evans, on the demography of Iran with Jalal Abbasi and Meimanat Hosseini. I was drawn back into research on Indonesia with the wonderful Ibu Utomo, Ariane's mother, I was very emotionally affected last year when she passed away. And today I work with Ariane, still very heavily on Indonesia. And then with Jeromey Temple and James Rice, I worked on economic demographic modelling. I also had the good fortune to supervise many brilliant PhD students from many countries. I thank them all for being such great scholars. At different points in my career, I've published with Helen Moyle, who's not well at the moment, and I thank her not just for that, but also for looking after me for a large slice of my life. And looking after me, in terms of looking after me, as have my children, Emily and James McDonald. Finally, a general thanks to all my academic colleagues in my 30 years at the Australian National University. I would need another 20 minutes to list them all, but it's getting late here in Melbourne. And my last words, I'll see you all in person at the International Population Conference in Brisbane, Australia in 2025. And thank you for everybody who spoke tonight. I was very moved by what was said. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think you deserve applause from the audience wherever we are. It's wonderful to hear your voice and to hear you discuss your career. And it's been wonderful to hear from your colleagues and admirers and learn even more about your remarkable achievements. So everyone, that ends our ceremony for today. Please do keep checking the IUSSP website. We have lots of interesting webinars and so on coming up, and we'd love to have you there. So thank you all. Good night to those in Australia. Good morning, and start your day to those in North America. Thank you, and bye-bye.